Okay, so um, can everyone see my screen? Okay, cool. So I'm just going to open up our um, React to-dos project, and I'll start the server. So npm run dev, and copy that URL. Open up a new incognito tab. Or actually, I'll do a regular, not incognito, because having having the local storage, it can't be an incognito tab for local storage to work right. Um, so we have our Moose app that we've been working on. You can add a moose, you can remove a moose, and that should all be good. And I think today we're going to be doing some asynchronous stuff. And again, I haven't seen the assignment this week yet, but I assume it's going to be connecting to an API. So yeah, let's get started. Um, okay, so asynchronous data conditional rendering, advanced and impossible state. It's a long name. Okay, so we're going to learn about promises and async data, understand when and how to use conditional rendering to navigate and update pages, and learn about state beyond how it's used in a component. Cool. Okay, overview. JavaScript is synchronous in nature. This means that JavaScript runs code in the sequence they're written. Asynchronous is the opposite of synchronous. Asynchronous code will not be executed immediately. They will only be executed after a certain event occurs. One example is when we click a button. So here we have a button, a query selector on the button, and then we're adding an event listener for when we click. And when you click on the button, it runs this callback function and console logs button clicked. So it's asynchronous because this logic, this callback function, only gets called when you actually click it. It doesn't get called in the normal sequence of running the code just line by line. The asynchronous part happens within the add event listener. The callback doesn't run unless a click event occurs. This means JavaScript has effectively waited for something to happen. This wait is asynchronous. It delayed the code from being executed immediately. Callbacks are a fundamental concept in asynchronous JavaScript. Another example is executing functions after a certain amount of time has passed. We can do this with set timeout. Okay, so set timeout is, it comes default in JavaScript, and it's a way to wait for a certain amount of seconds or milliseconds and then run some code. And so you call set timeout, you pass in a callback function, and then the second argument is a delay. So you're saying, I want a timeout, I want to wait for a certain delay period, and then I want to run this code. And this delay is in milliseconds. So 1,000 milliseconds is 1 second. So this would wait 1 second and then console log 1 second has passed. And just a little bonus. You might have noticed that I shifted this from goose to moose. Originally it was frogs. I've just been playing around with this, but you'll probably notice I have mooses or meese floating around the page here occasionally. And in order to make that happen, I'm actually using some asynchronous code. It's under Moose Magic. I have a UseEffect, and in this UseEffect here, I have I'm calling set interval, which set interval is similar to set timeout, except it's set timeout that runs repeatedly on a timer. And you can feel free to dig into this. It should be up on, like I posted the code from my last lecture on Code Sandbox if you want to see it. But it does get a little bit complicated. But the idea here is the reason that I can have these mooses floating around the screen is because I'm doing some logic that waits for a certain amount of time to pass. So a certain amount of time passes, and then randomly a moose will appear on the screen and start floating. And yeah, so that's an example of some asynchronous JavaScript that I was using. And you have to use it in a UseEffect. So UseEffects are how you use asynchronous JavaScript in React. Okay, what is an API? An API stands for Application Programming Interface. It is code that allows you to talk to other programs through code you write. Other programs, in this case, refers to code that others have written. For example, the code above using document.querySelector that lets you select an element is just one small part of the DOM API. Okay, so the DOM API is an API. There's lots of different APIs. And it's basically just how you interact with some application or library or framework. It's kind of the set of functions and ways for interacting with some system in code. AJAX versus asynchronous JavaScript. AJAX means asynchronous JavaScript and XML. When people say AJAX, they normally refer to the process of fetching a resource. Step 1 is send a request to a server. Step 2 is wait for a response to come back. The term AJAX was used in the past because the response will come back in an XML form. The term AJAX is outdated since we don't use XML anymore. We use JSON now. JSON. JSON stands for JavaScript Object Notation. We use JSON as the main format to pass information between browsers and servers today. A JSON object looks like a JavaScript object. The main difference between JSON and JavaScript is 1, JSON can only contain strings, and 2, JSON property and value pairs are always wrapped with double quotes. Okay, so this is some JSON. You've probably started to see JSON here and there, at least the word. And what JSON is it's a format for a file. It's like kind of like a programming language, but it's more just a syntax that you use for storing information. Like you could store it as just plain text or binary or something, but JSON is one format of communicating and storing and sending information around. And it's JavaScript object notation, so it looks like a JavaScript object, except for the keys and values are strings. And yeah, when you're using APIs, like when we were using the local storage, we had to turn our JavaScript arrays and objects and stuff into a JSON format. And you can see that here. We have a, let's see, I think that would be in our add moose form. Or no, it'd be in our app because we passed it down. Yeah, so we do JSON.stringify and then pass in some data, and that turns it into a JSON string. And then when we want to turn it back into from a JSON format to normal JavaScript, we use json.parse. So that's how we're storing something into our local storage as JSON and then converting it back into regular JavaScript. Okay, fetching resources. There are two ways to fetch resources using XML HTTP request or using the fetch API. And honestly, I've never even heard of this, or I probably have. There are certain things that I don't pay attention to because I don't see them. This is probably not anything like Ajax. I've never used Ajax. I've heard the word, but that's, the new way of doing it is not using Ajax. I think it might be relevant for certain circumstances, but for what we are doing, you just need to know about JSON and the fetch API. So yeah, fetch is the way to do it. So the fetch API is a newer method that allows you to perform Ajax. To send a request with fetch, you call fetch and then pass in a URL and options. The URL is the address you want to request information from, and options is a JavaScript object that lets you provide extra options. To see the response from fetch, you need to write a then statement. So fetch, and then you pass in a URL to the thing that the URL that has like a server or a database with data. And then you say .then, and then the .then is this syntax that can start to look really confusing. But basically what it does is it waits for fetch to interact with another computer over the internet and get some data. And then once the data comes back, then it will run the code in the then. So fetch, then do this callback here, get the response. And so just kind of the zoomed out high level overview of what fetch is. Fetch is going to allow us to interact with another computer with our app. So we can write code that, fetches from any database out there in the world. Well, most databases are going to have some sort of key, and so you're locked out. You can't get in. There's certain like open APIs, certain APIs that allow you to actually send requests from your app, and they'll send requests back. And they're actually servers in the world that you're in, like data centers and stuff, and your computer will actually be sending requests over the internet and getting data from these other computers out there in the world. And so that's what we're going to be doing today. We're going to be connecting your app to some other server over the internet and getting some data from another computer. Before we can use the data in the response variable, we need to convert this readable stream into JavaScript before we can use it. This is done with response.json that comes from a fetch response. Then you can get the payload in the next then method. Okay, so this is just basically required. There's a certain syntax that you just have to use when you're using fetch, and it looks like this. And I'll tell you about the parts that are going to change that you need to be aware of, and then the parts that are going to look the same pretty much every time. But the URL is going to change based on where you want to get data from. So you can actually find APIs online on the internet, and they'll give you a URL that you can use. This second then is, like it said here, converting the readable stream into JavaScript. So this second then is saying we're going to get this stream of data from the API, and to turn it into an actual like final JavaScript object, there's just one last step, which is another then. Or you have to call response.json, which is another asynchronous action, and then the second then will give us the data. It's a little harder to explain this without having my slides, but hopefully it'll start to make sense. And when we start writing code, hopefully you'll see how it all works. It's kind of one of those things where you have to see it multiple times before it can really stick in your head. But that's fine. Okay, understanding promises. A JavaScript promise is an if-else statement for the future. We don't know whether the statement will flow into if or else until the future arrives. So the promises have 3 states: pending, resolved, or rejected. All promises have the then and catch methods. We act on resolved promises in then. We can act on rejected promises in catch. So there's this kind of correlation between promises and fetch and .then in asynchronous JavaScript. They're all kind of correlated. So fetch is the method that JavaScript exposes, or the function that JavaScript has for us that you can interact with the internet. .then is the syntax that you use when you're doing asynchronous code, which fetch is an asynchronous function. So we have to use .then. There's another way to do it, but there's another way using async and await. There are 2 new keywords. It's the new way in JavaScript to do it, but they're having you do it this way, which is fine. Promises are kind of what's going on behind the scenes. You can make a promise in JavaScript, and whoever made the fetch function for JavaScript was using promises to make it actually work. So promises are the part that are actually allowing all this to work. But you don't necessarily need to understand them fully. It basically is an object in JavaScript that will either be pending, resolved, or rejected. And depending on those states, you can write some code that does a specific thing depending on whether the fetch request was fulfilled or not, basically. Okay, if you return a value from the call, then you can use that value in the next call. Response.json in the fetch API uses this feature. Remember, a fetch request is a promise. So we're fetching, .thenning, getting the data. If an error occurs in a promise chain, the error will be passed directly into the next catch call. It will skip any of the calls along the way. This means we can handle all errors with a single catch call. So basically what this means is you have a .catch, which is similar. It's the same syntax as .then, where it's a function that you put a callback function inside of. .catch will appear at the end of your .thens. And that means if an error happens within any of your .thens, like you try to fetch to a server, but the server is down or something, then it'll end up in your .catch, and you can like choose what you want your app to do, like maybe display an error message to the user or something. So it'll only end up in the .catch if there's an error. All promises have a finally method. This method will be called after, then, and catch calls. It's optional and not always needed, and mainly used for cleanup. So promise, .then, .catch, and then finally. So I rarely use finallys. It's just the last final thing in this chain of functions that'll be called. Async and await. The purpose of async and await is to make the complicated asynchronous code easier to understand. It does this by making asynchronous code look synchronous. Okay, I hope that in the assignment they have us using async and await, because those are the easier ways to do it. So async and await basically replaces this .then thing. Instead of .then, we can use a new way of doing it in JavaScript New as in, I think it came out in like 2016, with these keywords async and await. Await. So you declare asynchronous functions with the async keyword. The async keyword must be placed before the function keyword. Async function, function name, arguments, and then do something asynchronous. So when you want a function to be asynchronous, you put the keyword async before it. You can also create asynchronous functions with the arrow function syntax. In this case, you write async before the arguments. So this is declaring a variable, and then this is an arrow function that is asynchronous because you put async before the arguments of the arrow function. You can call asynchronous functions in the same way you call normal functions. So you can call an asynchronous function normally, but you'll typically want to call them using the await keyword. Asynchronous functions use promises underneath the hood, so they always return a promise. The await keyword lets you wait for a promise to resolve or reject before proceeding to the next line of code. The await keyword must be written inside the asynchronous function. Okay, so async function gets something, and then, so this is an asynchronous function that we're making. And then inside the asynchronous function, we're going to wait for this fetch to return. So we're going to wait for our computer to send this request out to a server at that URL. And then once our computer gets the data back, which it'll be fast, it'll be like a few hundred milliseconds. It'll be less than a second usually. But in coding terms, your code will run much faster than this will return. So you have to use await if you want to wait for the response from fetch. Otherwise, use .then. But here we're going to use await because it's better. You can use try and catch block to check whether promises resolve or reject. This is very similar to then and catch calls within a promise. So it's getting a little bit crazier looking, but again, we're creating a function that's asynchronous called get something. The function is asynchronous because inside of it, we're going to have an await. And if you have await inside of a function, then the function itself has to be asynchronous. So this is an asynchronous function that's going to wait for a fetch call. And then we have this new syntax, which is the try and catch blocks. And they kind of look like an if and else. And you can think of them as kind of like an if else. It's basically gonna try running this. If an error occurs anywhere in this try block, then it'll skip into this catch block and run that code. If an error never occurs, then it'll never end up in this catch. So whatever is in here will never run. So this is the alternate way using async and await of handling errors. And so because our computer is going to be interacting with other computers out there in the world, we don't know for sure whether those computers are going to be up and running and everything's going to work fine. And so that's why try and catch are a thing, is because it's a form of error handling when we're not in charge of all the code. There's some other external variables that we aren't aware of when our code is running. And so we want to handle if there's an error. You don't have to nest all await calls inside a try catch block. When we use the async function, we attach a catch block to handle all errors. Okay, async function get something, const response equals await fetch, resource link. Okay, so we're calling fetch. We're waiting for it to end, or we're waiting to get the response back using await. And then we're storing the response in this variable. And then the response is actually going to be a data stream. So there's this annoying additional step that we have to do where we call response.json. which turns the stream of data that we're getting from this API into an actual real like JavaScript object. So it turns it from like a readable stream into yeah, a real JavaScript object. And then here it's saying we can make this function that calls from the like external API and does fetch and all that. And we can do whatever we want. And then we can take this function and call it and then do a catch, a dot catch afterwards. This is a different way. Instead of doing a try catch block, you can call dot catch at the end of the function that we just made. It's just another way of handling that error if we get one. Okay. Sorry, lots of reading, lots of theory, but we're gonna get into some coding now. So let's see how this goes. Okay, so we're gonna start with removing custom hook. So open app, and maybe I'll take this page and I'll put it in a way that I can have it side by side with my code here. Okay. So, okay, so we're in app.jsx, and we're going to delete the hook, the custom hook we made, use semi-persistent state. And then, or actually, how about before I do that, let's create a new Git branch. So I'm going to say Git checkout, or let's do a Git push origin. I'll show you the actual way that, like, just all the steps involved in this. I would do Git push origin and then the current branch that I'm on, lesson 1.6, and this is the demo version of it. So I do that. And this will push the current version of this branch up to GitHub. I hope. It's taking a minute.
I guess sometimes when you have a lot of cool graphics, it just takes a little longer.
Yeah. Let's see. I'm gonna find my find this repo on GitHub. I think that when you're learning to code and you have to learn Git too, it can definitely like be extra complicated and make learning to code like harder than you wish it was, because you have to learn Git at the same time. So I figure it might be useful to do a little bit of Git stuff live. But my computer's being super slow. Oh, I have 1,000 pictures of mooses. That's why it's taking so long. Okay. Well, while that's happening, I'll just start coding. How about? Okay, so we're going to delete this semi-persistent state function. Or delete the function call from app. Okay. So I'm going to take that and delete it. Copy the use state and use effect hooks from use semi-persistent state back into app. Okay, so we're taking this custom hook and we're actually going to take it back into our our main app component, it looks like. Copy the use state and use effect hooks back into the app. Okay. So I'm going to copy and paste. So now our everything that was in our custom hook, pretty much except for the return, is now back in our app. And then we're going to delete this and run our application, make sure that our to-do list still appears, which it does. And how about, does anyone have any good moose celebrity names we could do? So I can just test it out.
I guess Bambi is not really a moose.
I think it's close enough. Do Bambi.
True.
Okay, let's try it out. Cool, it worked. Okay. So our app is still working. We're still able to add Mies. So that's good. And I could do a, okay, cool. And Git had an issue. Okay. We're not doing Git today because I think I added too many pictures to this repo and it's having trouble pushing it. So scratch that. We're not doing Git today either. Sorry. Okay. Okay. Async. Currently, our list data is being retrieved synchronously from the browser's storage, but in the next lesson, we'll be fetching it asynchronously from an API. Let's update our code to mimic asynchronous data fetching. Okay, so the way our app is right now, we're using local storage, which is that like database that's built into your browser that allows you to keep some of this information even when you reload the page. And we're gonna take that and make it asynchronous. Okay, so below the to-do list state, the moose list, define a UseEffect React hook with an empty dependency list. Okay. UseEffect. And the UseEffect takes a callback like that. And then the second argument is a dependency list, which is an array, and it's going to start empty. So this is kind of the basic syntax of the UseEffect, and then I'm sure we're going to add some more code inside. Okay, so empty dependency list, that's what we have. Inside the side effect handler function, define a new promise and pass in a callback function with parameters resolve and reject. Okay, the promise constructor. Okay. Okay, it's been a long time since I've written JavaScript promises, so I'm definitely going to have to do a little bit of Googling, and I apologize for that. I'm used to using just, I don't know. I probably should learn how to use promises better. New promise. And then you pass in a callback, which has resolve and reject. I'm gonna look it up really quick because I don't want to get this wrong. JavaScript promise. Okay, new promise. Okay, resolve and reject our parameters. And then inside you can call resolve or reject. So they're functions themselves that can do stuff. Okay, so I'll say new promise. Oh, and just in case you're curious, I get these like code snippets. These are like answers from stuff like Stack Overflow and stuff. And they appear right in my like Google search homepage. It's because of an app or an extension I have called Code Grepper. So if you're curious, or I guess it's just called Grepper. I'll put a link to it. It's really useful for okay, that's in the chat. This is a really useful tool for getting quick. These are like user submitted things. So like some user submitted this and I can like upvote it or downvote it. It's kind of almost like Stack Overflow or something is like in your Google search homepage, which is nice. Okay, so I'm using that. I'm looking at this new promise syntax. So it takes in a callback function with resolve and reject as parameters. And then if we want it to, we want to consider it resolved, we call resolve like a function like that. If we want to consider it rejected, we call reject like a function like that. Okay. Inside, define a promise and pass in a callback function with parameters resolve and reject. Okay, so we did that. To mimic a loading delay inside the callback function, declare a timeout. Hint, use the set timeout method with the following arguments. A callback function with no parameters, and a delay time of 2000 milliseconds, 2 seconds. Okay. So inside here, instead of calling resolve and reject, we're going to do a set timeout. And remember, set timeout comes default in JavaScript, and it's a way to make your JavaScript code wait for a certain amount of time before it does something. And the syntax is it's a function, so you call it, and then you pass in a callback function like that. And then the last parameter is a number of milliseconds you want to wait before it calls your callback function. So we're going to wait 2000 milliseconds, and then whatever's in this callback function, like if we did a console.log pi, from the point that this code runs, it'll wait 2 seconds, and then it'll run this callback function inside. So this is an asynchronous bit of code right here. Okay, so the callback function has no parameters. The delay time is 2 seconds. Inside the callback function, call the parameter resolve, which is a callback function for, so we have callbacks within callbacks within callbacks. And it gets kind of crazy, but call the parameter resolve, which is a callback function for when the promise is successful, and pass it an object with the property data as a nested empty object. Okay. So we want to call resolve in this set timeout. And then we want to pass in an object with the property data as a nested empty object. So how would I just make that object right here? I'll say const object equals, and it's going to look like an empty, or it's going to look like an object, right? With a property called data. And the property data is a nested empty object. So it's going to look like that. That's the object we're passing in. So I'm going to take that object and I'm going to put it in there in the resolve. So now we're calling resolve with an object that has a property called data that has a nested empty object. We could do this without defining object separately. Like if I delete object right there, I could do it like resolve. I could do it like that too. That's going to do the same thing. In my opinion, doing it like this is just a little bit cleaner. It is easier to read. So I'm going to do it like that. Okay, inside the data object, add a property to-do list and set its value to the initial default list state. Copy from the use state hook. Okay, so I'm going to use the moose list, set its value to the initial default list state. Okay, so the initial default list state is right here, existing mies. And remember, this comes from JSON.parse local storage.get item, save moose list. And then I added this thing at the end here. You don't have to worry about it. It can sometimes help with if you don't have anything in your local storage, this will come back as null and then or undefined, and then that'll give you an issue. And so this will say, if that comes back as undefined, then set it to an empty array instead. This is the nullish coalescing operator. That wasn't part of your assignment, but this is something that I've noticed prevents an error that sometimes happens for me. So I have that there. But this code right here for getting this gets our moose list out of local storage when your app loads. So if you have anything in your local storage, this will get it out. How about I just take that value, existing mies, and I set it as the data property. I think that's what it was, right? Inside the data object, add a property to-do list. Oh, okay. So inside of here, I have to add my moose list and set its value to the initial/default list state, copy from the use state hook. Okay. So I'm going to use existing mies here. If in your app, if you aren't if you're doing your local storage get item thing, if you're doing that part inside of this hook right here like that, then you can always just copy that and put it right there like that for this part. You don't have to store it in a separate variable. Basically, I was storing that in a separate variable so that it's easier to kind of reason about. Okay, update the default state for to-do list to be an empty array. Okay, so that's what I figured would be the next step. We're taking this and we're just going to set the default state before it was existing mies. And now we're going to set it to a default of just an empty array. And therefore, we probably don't need this either anymore. Or maybe we do. I'll see. I'll keep it there for now. Okay. Update the default state for to-do list to be an empty array. Okay, we just did that. View your application in the browser. Notice that the to-do list is now empty and doesn't persist after refresh. Let's see. Yep, it's empty. I'll try adding a new moose and then refresh and it's gone. Okay. So what's missing? We're retrieving our list from local storage, but we aren't updating our to-do list state with the data, so it remains empty. Let's fix that. So we're going to chain a then method to your promise constructor. So when it says promise constructor, that's just a fancy way of saying when you use the term new, when you're constructing a new, so promise is a class and you haven't really, I mean, I don't think you've gotten to classes yet at Code the Dream really, but a class is like a factory for making a specific type of object. And so promise is a class. When you use new, you're calling the class's constructor function. And so when it says constructor, all it's talking about is this syntax right here. It's saying new promise, and then we pass in some data. This data is going to end up, or we're passing in whatever code is in here. This is getting passed into the promises constructor. Where was I? Chain a dot then method to your promise constructor and pass it a function with the parameter result. Okay. So we have a UseEffect here, and I'll just separate this stuff with a line so we can see where we are. So we have our UseEffect on the outside. We are making a new promise. Inside this promise, we have our resolve and reject. So this is creating some asynchronous code, basically. And then we're retrieving inside this set timeout here. After 2 seconds, we're going to retrieve our moose object. And I can actually, how about I just take this existing moose thing up here? I'll delete that, and I'll just paste it in here, because we don't need it up there anyways. We're not using it up here anymore. So existing moose is going to be here. And I'm going to put it inside this object, inside a property called data, inside a property called moose list. And so we're going to chain a dot then call after our promise constructor, which our promise constructor starts here. And let's see, where does it end? And this is one of the things that's useful about having a colored, like the syntax highlighting. I have colored, zoom in here. I have colored parentheses. So the green one is the start of this constructor. So I'm going to go down to the green one here. That should be the end of this constructor call. So right here, I'm going to do dot then. I know it's so much nested code, it gets really hard to read. That's JavaScript for you. That's how it goes. Okay, chain a then method onto your promise constructor and pass it a function with the parameter result. Okay, so this dot then here, we're going to pass in a callback function, right? Pass in a function with the parameter result. Yep. Okay. So we're going to do an arrow function here, dot then, and then this is a function inside our dot then, an arrow function with the parameter result. So result, strangely enough, will end up being this. So when we do resolve object, what that'll do is it'll say, okay, this promise is over. It's going to resolve to this object, which is this, which has our moose in it. So our result will come from this promise from our resolve, or from the reject, which we're not going to do a reject, I don't think. So this object will be this result. That's what I'm saying. Inside the function, use your setter or your state setter to update the list and pass the to-do list from your result object. Okay, so state setter, which is set moose list, to update the list and pass the to-do list from your result object. Okay, so we have our result object here. In this dot then, we're going to call set moose list, which is our setter for this moose list state in React. It's that. And we're going to pass in the result, but not just the result, because the result is going to be this whole object. So we probably just want to pass in the result dot data dot moose list. So I'm going to pass in result dot data dot moose list. I know it's a lot. It's getting confusing. And one thing I could do is like what I've been doing before. I'll make a new variable and I'll say const. Well, Yeah, I could say retrieved moose list equals result.data.moose list. And then I could pass in that variable. That's an alternative to just writing this in here. If that makes more sense, if that's easier to look at, you can do it that way. Okay. So we did that. View your application in the browser. You'll now notice that the list is being saved in local storage, but after refreshing the page, it is reset to empty. This is because our other side effect is overwriting data before the asynchronous fetch is complete. We need a way to know that the data is still loading before trying to update it in local storage. Okay, so let's verify this. It says we can save a list in local storage, but after refreshing it, it'll go empty. Yeah, it's empty. Reset or reload and it's empty. So we need to fix that. We need a way to know that the data is still being loaded before trying to update it in local storage. Okay, so we still have our other use effect. And we're setting the moose list to an empty, or we're setting our local storage moose list to the empty moose list from the start, which we don't want. So we want to say, while this use effect is doing its thing, we want this one to not update. Okay, add loading state. After to-do list state declaration, create a new, okay, so after here, create a new state variable named isLoading with update function named setIsLoading with a default value of true. Okay, so we're making some new React state to represent that we're loading right now. So const isLoading and setIsLoading equals use state with a default value of true. So by default, when our app loads, we're going to be, this loading state is going to be true. We're going to be loading. And we want to know if we're loading because we're going to be imagining that we're like our app, you can imagine you pull up Facebook and for just a brief minute or second, your posts haven't loaded yet. And it's because something like this is going on. We have this like asynchronous code that's retrieving our Facebook posts in that case. And while it's retrieving them, we have some state that says we're currently loading. We could show a specific thing to the user that indicates that we're loading. And then once this asynchronous code resolves and we get the Facebook posts, or in this case, the moose list, then isLoading can be set to false. And so isLoading is going to indicate whether we have finished this or not. Okay, so we made this new isLoading state. Inside the second UseEffect hook with the moose list dependency, add an if statement to check that isLoading is false. Maybe I'll shrink this down a bit. Okay, inside the second UseEffect hook with the to-do list dependency, add an if statement to check that isLoading is false before setting local storage. Okay, so what that's saying is this UseEffect here is setting the mooses in our local storage. It's saying local storage set item. We're setting our moose list to the value of moose list whenever the app loads and whenever moose list changes. But now we want to say, if we're currently loading, then don't set isMooseList because isMooseList is going to be an empty array. So we don't want to overwrite our mooses in our local storage if we're loading. So I'm going to say if is loading, return. That's one way we can do it. Let's see. Inside, add an if statement to check that is loading is false before setting local storage. Okay, so this is one way of doing it. This would be called an early return or a guard clause. This is one thing that I learned like in a function that you don't want to run if something is like we could wrap this whole thing in an if statement, or we could do an early return, which will make sure that none of this runs. So that's what this is doing. The alternative, which is the way that they're asking, is you can say if not is loading, run this code. Two ways of doing it. And then we are going to get this ESLint error. It's going to say, we want to add is loading as a dependency. So whenever we're using state inside a UseEffect, it's going to complain at you unless you add that state into the dependency array. So that's what I'm going to do here. I'm going to add is loading to that dependency array. So now whenever is loading happens or changes, it'll run this also. Okay, now we just need a way to turn loading off once the data has been fetched. So, okay, so loading is on by default, and now we need to switch it to false. Probably somewhere in here. Okay, so revisit the then callback. Yep.
Would you mind explaining just a little bit more like why we add is loading to the dependency array, why that's necessary right there?
Yeah. So our dependency array says whenever these state variables change, whenever the value of these change, it's going to run this callback in our UseEffect. So the UseEffect can be thought of as saying, I'm going to wait to call this callback until these things change. It's almost like you can think of like an event listener that waits for a click event and then it runs some code. A UseEffect is going to wait for these variables to change and then it's going to run this code. So anytime they change, it's going to run this code. Your linter, ESLint, is going to complain at you if you're using a state variable inside here, like is loading, that's a state variable, like React state. It's going to complain if you're using one of those in here, but you don't have it in the dependency array, because it's going to go, oh, you're trying to depend on some value, some state variable being a certain value in here, but you're not ensuring that this code runs when that variable changes, which by default, you typically want to call your UseEffect when these things change, because that's kind of the whole point of it, is you're saying when these variables change, we want to like update our external system, our local storage. We're not currently using is loading to do anything besides just make sure that we don't set local storage when moose list is empty. So technically, we don't need it in the dependency list. We're not going to get an error. It's actually going to work fine just like that. But ESLint is going to complain if we don't do that. And so you can sometimes just get used to just putting your state variables in here. Really what we want is when the moose list changes, we want to update our local storage with the updated moose list. Is loading just happens to be a little guard that says, don't update this. Like if we're loading, then don't do this. Technically having it in this dependency array isn't going to change anything, because moose list is going to change whenever is loading changes. Is loading is never going to change when moose list doesn't change. So technically it's going to like run at the same time. So we could just leave it like that, but just it doesn't make a difference in this case, and it gets rid of the ESLint complaining.
Okay. Thank you so much for the explanation. That clarified a
Yep.
lot.
Yeah, and UseEffect is just confusing in general, and so it's like totally valid that it's, like what is the dependency array? It's very confusing. When it's empty, it does a certain thing. When it's not empty, when it's not there at all, it does a certain thing. UseEffect is a very hard to kind of wrap your head around concept, but hopefully like just seeing it over and over, you'll start to get like a more an intuition for it. And like with a lot of this stuff, like I'm sure this is looking pretty intimidating to a lot of you. And that's just it's like repetition. The more you see it, the more you get used to it. So
Makes sense.
okay. Now we just need a way to turn off the and the first time I learned any of this, just so everyone knows, my my head was spinning too. It's a lot to take in. It's a lot to understand. So don't worry if you're feeling like overwhelmed or confused. I wouldn't expect any of you to be able to just write this out on your own first try without any help. Okay, so we're gonna revisit the then callback in the UseEffect hook. So we have this UseEffect up here. We have two UseEffects. Our top one has this new promise we made with a dot then. So we're gonna revisit this dot then. After setting the to-do list state, or our moose list, add another line to set is loading to false. Okay. So we've retrieved our moose list from local storage. And now we want to set loading to false to indicate we're not loading anymore because we retrieved our moose list from storage. In the future, this might be an API call. Like in the future, this would be pretty much the main line you'd have to change right here if you wanted to fetch from an API. If you wanted to say like fetch, facebook.com. You could imagine whoever made Facebook, they wrote something like that. So we're getting existing Facebook posts or whatever. So that's what we're doing. We're writing some asynchronous code, even though local storage isn't asynchronous and we were doing the same thing synchronously. We're preparing for when you want to use an actual API out there in the world. So that's kind of the key thing that we're doing here. Okay, so we're going to set is loading to false once we've retrieved our mooses or our meese from the local storage. We're going to view our application in the browser and try it out. Okay, so we're going to add a new moose and reload the page and wait 2 seconds. And then the saved item now appears in the list. Okay. Let's see. Do we have any moose name suggestions so we can try out our app? I could get Gemini on board. I've been using Gemini recently. Gemini is it's like ChatGPT. It's Google's version. So give me some moose celebrity name
Apparently,
puns.
Faline, Faline, was one of the characters in Bambi, and she was a deer, although not quite a moose.
What was that?
Faline, Fallon, apparently was a character in the Bambi cartoon and
Fallon.
was a deer, although not quite a moose.
Oh, my internet's being so slow. Okay, we'll add it. Cool.
If you want another one, Ronald was a deer too, and he had antlers. That was
Like that?
Ronno.
Rono.
Um, I guess, although
I
I
think that's
don't
good.
see anything other than background image right now.
Oh, on my screen?
Yeah, that's all I'm seeing right now is the background.
Oh, is maybe I'll stop my screen share. Let me try again. Okay. Is it better?
Yeah, now I see it. It's
Okay.
perfect.
Sorry, y'all. Okay. Cool. So, uh, thank you, Natalie, for the new mooses, the new meese. So now we're going to test it and we're going to see if we reload our page. What we're expecting is it's going to wait 2 seconds while the loading thing happens, while the set timeout happens. And then hopefully we get our meese showing back up after 2 seconds. So I'm going to reload and we're waiting and there they are. Cool. So that's simulating our application fetching data from an external API, waiting a couple seconds, and then we all of a sudden get our meese loaded in. So that worked, which is good. Okay. Let's see. Where are we? Okay, so we have our loading state. Great, now our data is being saved properly again, but the delay in loading makes it seem like the list is empty at first. Okay, so you load the page and you don't get any indication that there's going to be data there. So we need some sort of loading icon that tells the user, oh, you have meese, they're just on the way. You need to wait. So we're going to add a loading icon or indicator. Inside app.jsx, create a new paragraph element above the to-do list with text loading. Okay. So inside here, we're going to go all the way down to our JSX and above the to-do list, right? Yeah, add a paragraph element with the text loading. Okay. So over our meese list, I'm going to add a paragraph and I'm going to say loading. And now that should be there all the time at the moment, right? Yep, there it is, loading. So that's going to just appear always. It's not going to disappear when the meese are here. Now we're going to add some logic to say when we're loading, don't show this. When we're done loading, or when we're loading, show this. When we're done loading, hide it. So that's going to be conditional rendering. So based on the state variable, is loading, if is loading is true, we want this to be displayed. If it's false, we don't want it to be displayed. So conditional loading. Okay, reload the page. Notice that the loading message is still visible. Wait 2 seconds and the loading thing is still there. Okay, we don't want to always show the loading indicator. It should conditionally appear based on the is loading state. Using a ternary operator inside JSX, is loading, if is loading is true, render the loading message, otherwise render the to-do list component. Okay, ternary operator. I'm gonna check, make sure that everyone's awake. Can someone walk me through making the ternary operator? Someone
Sorry.
besides Natalie.
Okay,
I
sorry.
appreciate you, Natalie. I love your support, but I'm wondering if anyone else who doesn't contribute often wants to speak up. We're doing a ternary operator. How to write a ternary. Does anyone remember?
I can try.
Yeah.
If I'm not mistaken, there should be first the state like is loading, then block.
Um,
Not it. It should be block, I guess.
block.
And
Question mark.
oh, a question mark and then block. Yeah. First question mark. If it is true, what do we do here? So we're gonna show the paragraph
Yep. So if true,
and then
and
block.
then I'll have the paragraph. And
Then block.
Semicolon.
Yeah.
going to do a colon. And then the false.
Yes.
Right. So we're going to have is loading. And then if it's true, we're going to do that. If it's false, we're going to have the mise list like that. So it's going to be an inline if statement. Good job. Thank you for contributing. Okay. So again, the syntax for a ternary operator is condition, question mark, and then if, let me do this in a comment. Condition, expression, if true, colon, expression, if false. So it's a one line if statement. It's a way of doing an if statement that only is in one line. And in React, you're going to use these a lot. It's because we can't write an if statement inside our JSX. We can write a ternary operator though. So I'm gonna take this ternary operator is loading. I'm gonna paste that right here. If we're loading, return this. If not, return this. And then there's one last step. We have to wrap this all in curly braces. There it is. So if we're loading, it'll return this, and then this whole thing will evaluate to that. If we're not loading, the whole thing will evaluate to that. And actually, I can remove that part too. I can remove that mise list. And then my formatter, this is prettier, making it kind of more readable, but also kind of confusing. So is loading, return loading. If not, return that. So now, depending on our loading state, we're going to render either our loading paragraph tag or the mise list. So let's try it out. For your application in the browser, reload the page, make sure the loading message is visible, wait 2 seconds, then the loading indicator should disappear and the to-do list or the mise list becomes visible. So let's try this out. Loading, and then our mise list. And that's it. We finished. Yeah. Okay. Good job, everyone. That was easy, huh? Not really.
It was with your guidance.
I'm glad. It's a lot. This was definitely, I'm so sorry that I didn't come prepared with like slides and stuff because
It's all good.
I thought we were on
This
next
was very
week already, but I'm glad. Yeah, this was definitely one of the harder assignments so far, I think. So thanks to everyone for being here and sticking with it. And I'm going to post this code on Code Sandbox, and I'll put a link on Slack. And then I'll post a recording or the recording of this on YouTube, and then I won't be posting the slides because I didn't make slides, but yeah, you should be able to hopefully yeah, rewatch this if there's parts that confused you and see the code. So cool. Okay. Any last questions? Any feedback? How's everyone feeling? Is anyone stuck on any part of it?
I think I just fixed my code so that it looks a lot less messy than it did before. Because yours is really neat.
That's good.
Thank you so much for explanation.
Yeah, of course.